The kinematic tool simplifies switching between kinematic modes and working with keyframe data in the timeline. It's designed for use with my prototyper rig and character model, which are all available at sleffy.gumroad.com. I want to take a moment to thank Pierrick at P2 Design not only for his wonderful courses, but for this video, where he laid out a foundation for approaching FK-IK snapping without using a script. While it certainly worked, I was beginning to feel, after using that approach a few times, that the amount of steps and effort required to carry it out were beginning to outweigh the reward, unfortunately. And I was a bit bummed because I felt like the tools I wanted to use to be creatively unrestrained were becoming more of a burden than a help, despite how helpful that approach was. But were it not for this little piece of inspiration right here in Pierrick's video, I might not have built the kinematic tool. And now, here we are, and it's working, and I'm back to enjoying the process of animating. Because of that, I hope this tool helps you find a deeper connection with the craft as well. Anyways, enough with the sentimental stuff. Let's talk about using the kinematic tool. At its core, the kinematic tool works on a system of bone chains and custom properties. 2 bone chains operate each limb. 1 forward kinematic or FK chain, 1 inverse kinematic or IK chain. Bones in the forward kinematic chain are controlled through rotation, while bones in the inverse kinematic chain follow a primary controller, and their positions can be refined with a pole that directs the joint at either the elbow or the knee. Adjusting any of the 4 custom property switches in the property controller bone changes the active kinematic chain. The commands in the kinematic tool work on these properties, and while you could brave the frustrating experience of switching kinematic chains directly through these custom properties, the tool is designed so you never have to fiddle with these switches directly. Once installed, the kinematic tool is accessible by right-clicking in pose mode. When accessing the commands in the kinematic tool, I approach them visually as belonging to 3 buckets. The first at the top is a lazy man's tool, which works on all the limbs at once, and I'll explain more on this command once we establish some context. The next bucket holds the commands for each limb, and you'll notice each limb has the same set of 3 commands. The final bucket holds a quality of life tool called Hide Inactive Kinematic Bones, and I'll cover that a bit later in this video as well. The 4 limbs inside the kinematic tool are arranged anatomically and as if reading a book. Anatomical perspective assumes your own perspective. So here we have the left and right sides, and when starting with the left arm, reading across as though you're reading a book, you arrive at the right arm, then down and across to the left leg, and finally the right leg. I tried several approaches to arranging this menu, even alphabetically, but ultimately I found myself working easiest with this arrangement, seeing that it felt the most visually consistent and intuitive. To understand the 3 commands that belong to each limb, let's work with the left arm. The first command, snap and key and switch, is designed to build poses quickly. Let's look at what happens when we go from FK to IK. With the FK chain currently active, I'll move the playhead to some random empty spot on the timeline. Notice also how the inactive IK chain is currently sort of dangling out here on its own. Clicking the command creates some visual changes. You'll notice the IK chain is now the only visible chain, and the primary controller at the wrist is actively selected, which allows me to immediately move it around. You'll also notice the column of 5 new keyframes in the timeline belonging to each of the arm's 4 IK bones, as well as the 1 keyframe for the custom property belonging to the property controller bone. When I unhide these bones with Blender's default shortcut Alt-H, you can see the other half of the changes that occurred. The FK chain is now visible and in the exact position it was before, right where the IK chain now sits. In the timeline of the action editor, you'll also see the newly stamped keyframes belonging to the 3 bones of the FK chain. I'll move the IK bones, then again click the snap and key and switch command. The active kinematic chain switches to the FK chain, the IK chain is now hidden, and all 3 bones of the FK chain are now selected, making the hand the active selection. The keyframes have also been updated. While this command is super helpful in constructing poses, it's a bit overkill when it comes to tweaking and managing the data in the timeline. For instance, once I've set up my poses, I don't want my bones to be hidden because those hidden bones will also disappear from the action editor. And there are times when I simply want to switch the active kinematic chain without stamping keys onto the current frame. Also, when I'm building poses for animation, I'm really only using this command when I want to change the way I control and manipulate the bones of each limb. And at this stage, I'm only concerned with the appearance of the poses, not the interpolation between them. For the purpose of interpolation, we'll use the snap and key and the switch commands. The snap and key command was designed to snap the inactive chain to the active chain and keyframe both chains at the same position. It doesn't switch the active chains, it doesn't hide any bones, and it doesn't select any bones. It's purely for aligning the bones to the currently active position. I use this command to align the chains of each limb before using the switch command. Now the switch command simply switches the active kinematic chain. It works intelligently on the currently active property keyframe, meaning it won't stamp a new key to the current frame, but instead it will alter the currently active keyframe. If you think of the timeline as a series of poses and their containers, the switch command works anywhere inside that container, including on the property keyframe and leading up to right before the next property keyframe. No other fancy operations are happening here, no selecting of bones, and no hiding of inactive chains. The switch command combined with the snap and key command gives you a lot of freedom because you could, if you wanted to, set up all your poses using only a single active kinematic chain, then align the inactive bones using the snap and key command to each pose, then follow it up with the switch command to ultimately decide the way the mesh moves between those snapped and keyed poses. In other words, snapping and keying sets points of destination. And once those points are set, the switch command lets you decide how you move between them, either through the circular movement of forward kinematics or the linear movement of inverse kinematics. To drive this point home, here I have a leg moving between two poses, back and forth, with both kinematic chains visible. At each pose, I've snapped and keyed the chains to the exact same position. Currently, the leg is moving between each pose using the swinging motion of forward kinematics, yet you can still see the tracking of the inverse kinematic chain. After using the switch command in each of these containers, the leg now moves between each pose using the linear motion of inverse kinematics. Both chains are arriving and departing from the same exact spot, but I've decided which chain is ultimately creating the final visual output for the animation. Now with that established, let's talk about the all limbs snap and key command. I like to call it the lazy man's tool because it ends up doing a lot of the work you would otherwise do for each individual limb. I placed it at the top of the menu because I found myself using it quite often when I was making lots of smaller adjustments to my poses along the timeline. It's the same snap and key command you see on each limb, but performed 4 times, once for each limb. Here, when I use the command, all the dangling inactive bones are snapped and keyed to the currently active bones. Nothing else happens. It doesn't switch active chains, it doesn't hide any bones or select anything. The hide inactive kinematic bones command does exactly what the name says, and you can unhide bones by using Blender's default shortcut Alt-H. It is important to note that relying on this command could cause some confusion if you assume it updates dynamically, which it doesn't. It only hides the inactive kinematic chains for the specific frame you're on. And if you move around your timeline and the state of the kinematics change, which for most animations they will, the bones that are hidden will remain hidden. For instance, if you use the command in this situation, where the active chain for the leg is the IK chain, the command will hide the inactive FK bones. But as I move across the timeline where the active chain is now clearly the FK chain, it won't update. So even though it's not dynamic, it's quite a useful option from time to time if you're just trying to eliminate some of the clutter in the viewport. Again, to unhide any of these bones, just use Blender's default shortcut Alt-H. And that's it for the kinematic tool, but I want to finish this video by talking about some of the gotchas, or the situations that may cause some rather unexpected outcomes. The first one to look out for is the interpolation mode used for the property keyframes. Reliably animating with this system requires the property keys to be set to constant interpolation mode, since the properties are switches, either existing in a state of 0 or a state of 1, with nothing in between. Here in this example, I'm transitioning between 2 poses with kinematic chains that are clearly snapped and keyed at those poses. Yet there's this strange and unwanted jump occurring here when I animate between the 2 poses. That's because the property keyframes are currently set to linear and switching between 0 and 1 before reaching the property keyframe of the next pose, and they're doing it on their own accord. You want the property value to remain constant up to the very next pose and onward. To do this, just double select these channels and hit the T key while hovering over the timeline to change to constant. Unfortunately, Blender's visual indicator for linear mode is the same as constant mode, and both linear and Bezier modes will cause trouble for your animations, so just be sure to double check and set the kinematic property keyframes of the property controller bone to constant mode, or you'll get some slipping. Next, if you're trying to animate along the timeline and you're getting rubber banding every time you use one of the kinematic tool commands, it's probably because your autokeying is off. I run with it on and with this option toggled, and my active keying set to whole character. You don't have to keep autokeying on if you don't want to. You could instead keyframe your bones before using the kinematic tool commands, but I find doing so is slow and inefficient, and for me, I want to be cruising. Now, hidden bones in the action editor will cause problems when you're moving your keyframe columns around to adjust the timing of your animation. Since using the snap and key and switch command hides the inactive kinematic chain, you might make the mistake of moving the columns around before unhiding all your bones. There were several times my animations were jumping a bit oddly until I unhid the bones and saw something like this. I had only moved the keyframes of one of the kinematic chains. As you're polishing your poses along the timeline and making small adjustments to the limbs, which you inevitably will, make sure to do some passes over your poses and snap and key your limbs, or you might find your limbs aren't arriving where you expected them to, especially after using the switch command. In most cases, you can just use the all limbs option. I often find adjusting the torso or the pelvis are the most common cases where I have to perform a small set of changes, such as in this run cycle animation where the foot is in forward kinematic mode because it's leaving the ground, but I want to raise the height of the torso a nudge, but doing so will lift the foot from its position from the ground, so I'll simply take a moment to switch the kinematic mode, raise the torso, snap and key, and switch back. Extreme unnatural angles for the foot pitch and foot roll controllers will cause the foot to leap positions. So just be conscious of that if you're trying to do some wild things while the leg is still actively using the inverse kinematic mode. For most cases where this is happening, just switch to forward kinematics. Changing the names of the bones of the rig, especially on the limbs, will break the kinematic tool, since the kinematic tool works off of specific bone names. Finally, just respect the information in the timeline and stay organized. And keep an eye on these property keyframes if you're trying to do some advanced stuff. For me, working with the kinematic tool is not a huge adjustment to the way I was working with data in the timeline, but it does demand some respect and organization. Ultimately, the time I now save using the kinematic tool far outweighs any of the frustrations and steps I was taking beforehand to create smooth and convincing animations. If you don't already own a copy of my prototyper rig, character model, and kinematic tool, and you'd like to animate with it, you can access it through sleffy.gumroad.com. Have fun and get animating.